Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar Weekly discussion topic video. This week I'm actually going to cover a bunch of different topics people suggested to me. None of the ones I got suggested I think really I could talk about for long enough to really be one of these videos. So I just thought that because these are usually like 20 plus minutes anyway, I'll just cover a bunch of them at once. So I suppose let's start off with probably one of the more interesting ones someone mentioned, and that was just for me to talk about the idea that what if the next water avatar was actually born into the Foggy Swamp tribe, and how would that work with regards to the avatar being actually discovered? Because obviously, they're a very kind of isolated tribe. Not a lot of people know they even exist, let alone being able to get there, come into contact with them, and train their avatar. So how would that work? Well, I suppose straight away, because we're on currently a water tribe avatar, we are immediately 4 generations away from the next one. So realistically, that's 100 plus years, probably more, probably closer to 200 years until we get to that avatar. And at that point we're in heavy technology. We don't even know what this Foggy Swamp tribe would actually be like at that point in time. Would they just persist as they are, low state of technology, just living in the swamps, just using their bending away from everyone else? Or would technology take over the world to the point where basically everyone uses it, or they remain one of the few kind of tribes out there that don't? But I suppose that's kind of avoiding the actual question. I suppose the question is more for example, if Korra happened to be born into the Foggy Swamp tribe, how would that have actually worked? To some extent, I assume the Order of White Lotus know about the existence of the Foggy Swamp tribe because Katara and Aang and stuff like that came into contact with them, and they would have known that the next avatar was being born into the water tribes, and just the existence that hey, there is another group of waterbenders out there, you might want to check this out, is probably something they knew about. But I suppose given the way it works, it seems like the Order of White Lotus responds to parents or people who claim to be the avatar or have the avatar as their child, in that they've already had, when they meet Korra's parents, they say they've had a lot of claims of people who are the avatar, but none were actually the case, and it was just Korra that happened to actually be the avatar when they came round. So it's one of those things, would they just after a while of okay, Aang died a good while ago at this point in time, the avatar is definitely born somewhere. We've checked the Northern Water Tribe, nearly every new child born. We've checked the Southern Water Tribe. Where on earth is the avatar? I assume after they've exhausted all possibilities, the Foggy Swamp tribe would be you really think they were happened to be born into the Foggy Swamp tribe? Is that the case? And they'd go there then and try and find that. Now, I suppose another example here is that Toph was in contact with the Foggy Swamp tribe as well. She seemed to know them relatively well, and given that she has the power to basically sense out people across the world, I assume the Order of White Lotus could have gotten into contact with Toph to help locate the avatar as well, given that she seems to be able to sense that someone is the avatar even if they're a different reincarnation of the avatar, and that she seemed to know Korra was the avatar without even Korra saying it. So that's very interesting. Now, on this same topic, what other situations could there be where the avatar would be difficult to find? That's the idea that popped into my head when I heard this question, and straight away I went to the Ancient Sun Warriors. Imagine the next fire avatar is born into the Ancient Sun Warriors. They are probably more isolationist than the Foggy Swamp tribe, because they are so ancient history Fire Nation that everyone thinks they're extinct, and it was just Aang and Zuko investigating their runes that happened to find them. They are purposefully kept a secret and ask everyone that comes to see them to keep them a secret. So how would that work? I would assume that it's one of these situations where the knowledge of them roughly being still out there is present in the world to some extent, that the Order of White Lotus would perhaps know that. And again, like the Foggy Swamp Tribe, would use it as a last resort. They'd look in Republic City, they'd look in the actual Fire Nation itself for the next avatar. But if they can't find it, they would probably check the Ancient Sun Warrior, temple and whatever. So that's very interesting. On the other side of things, like, would the Ancient Sun Warriors be okay with that? Because that would draw a lot of attention to them if they had the Avatar as one of their people. In that, straight away people would have to come, train them, they'd have to probably oversee the firebending training of the Fire Avatar by the Ancient Sun Warriors, and then organize them traveling between the nations or whatever. And would the Ancient Sun Warriors be okay with that? Because they're trying to keep their culture intact by not really interacting with outsiders, and keep obviously the dragons that they do have still safe, and their artifacts, which we assume is a dragon egg and stuff like that, intact. That's a really interesting scenario for sure. Like, how exactly would an Ancient Sun Warrior avatar work? Then, like, I suppose other examples would be like, we know people can technically live in the spirit world if they want to, if they go into one of the spirit portals. Imagine one of the avatars like happened to be born in the spirit world, and the people who like gave birth to the avatar were kind of lost in the spirit world or something like that, and had to like basically form a home there. How on earth would that work? Like, it would be really interesting. I suppose that's an interesting idea for a story, full stop. Like, people going into the spirit world and maybe living there in the same way that spirits are beginning to come and live in the physical world. Imagine the reverse scenario, people being born into the spirit world. That is a super interesting idea, and especially if the avatar was born in the spirit world, that is pretty crazy to me. Just to flat out think about it. It's a question that comes up. The main example I have of this would be that now that there is a spirit portal in Republic City, and there's a lot of crime still in Republic City, I can just imagine that on the Republic City police force, they're going to have to form some sort of a, spiritual squad to like deal with potential like kidnappers, robbers who escape into the spirit world through the portal to escape from justice. And they're going to need people who are experts at the spirit world to handle that sort of stuff. And so, to some extent, they should be thinking, the Order of White Lotus should be thinking about, like, what if, the Avatar happens to be in the spirit world? Like, there's so many weird places that could be the case. Another complex scenario would be harmonic convergence. Obviously made a lot of people airbenders. Now, the timing on this one doesn't work as well, but imagine the harmonic convergence happened at in or around the time when the next airbender avatar was to be born. Imagine the next airbending avatar was born into like a group of people who didn't really know that they had airbending, who got airbending at harmonic convergence, but their powers never really manifested, so they weren't ever really considered airbenders because they never used their powers. But when they had kids, they had a kid with the potential to be an airbender and happened to be the avatar. Imagine them trying to locate the next air avatar who could be potentially anywhere else in the world because of harmonic convergence, able to basically give airbending to anyone, like basically anywhere in the world, any nation. And that's a really interesting scenario as well. But I think that's about it for that topic. Just a really interesting idea. In the comments, definitely let me know any other like complex scenarios for where the avatar could be actually difficult to locate. Let me know if you have any clever ideas like I just presented to you. So next one, someone asked me to do a video on the Kyoshi Warriors, and I was planning to do that video this week, but when I came around to like thinking about it, it's a fairly simple story. Like the details that we have in the Kyoshi Warriors, it's not as complex as you would think. Because the Kyoshi Warriors, their story, like you can basically read it yourself. It's just read the free comic shells that came out for Free Comic Book Day a few years ago. Suki explains the origin story of the Kyoshi Warriors. It's basically that obviously Kyoshi, after forming the Dai Li and realizing that she made a mistake and that they became corrupt over time, for the most part retreated to her hometown of, Kyoshi Island, Kyoshi Village, whatever you want to call it. And eventually, over time, what began to happen is that Kyoshi Island, as a pretty important port city, they have their exports and stuff like that. A lot of people who came there to visit began to some extent, abuse the women that were on Kyoshi Island. And so to defend themselves, Kyoshi actually taught some of the women how to defend themselves and train them just in sort of self-defense in case any, guys did anything to them. And so over time, her just training a bunch of women in self-defense turned into more of a kind of organization that was more using these skills to actually protect the whole island. And then obviously when other stuff would happen, as more of a kind of humanitarian type unit, as Suki does, she goes out and participates in helping all over the world during Avatar The Last Airbender. And you obviously see that over time, I suppose after Kyoshi's death, they were so inspired by her that they really formed it into an actual organization, Kyoshi Warriors. They wear the exact same clothes, face paint, artifacts and stuff like that Kyoshi wore, because they were so respectful of her. The interesting thing, though, is in terms of their kind of fighting style, they're very kind of samurai-esque in that they wear that kind of, samurai-style armor. They all have katanas as weapons, but I suppose the unique thing is that they all use fans as well, which Kyoshi obviously used. So that's a really cool thing, that she had these unique weapons, but then her kind of followers, the Kyoshi Warriors, actually use them as well as a kind of shield type scenario and stuff like that. And it's just really interesting that they seem like these warriors who just specialize in the use of a lot of different style of weapons, and they have their own fighting style. They've later adapted in chi blocking to better fight benders, which is quite interesting, thanks to Ty Lee. And that's really about it. The only other thing I'd highlight in this story is just that this is Kyoshi forming a group kind of inadvertently, whereas the group that she purposefully formed, the Dai Li, became corrupt. The one that she didn't even purposefully form into a group, the Kyoshi Warriors, ended up being this group that has caused so much good in the world and being this very positive group in terms of helping the women on Kyoshi Island and just general effect on the world. So that's really about all there is to say about Kyoshi Warriors. My knowledge of Avatar kind of falls short of real world inspirations for things, so me just saying they're sort of samurai inspired is about the best I can go into. I don't really know the origins of their face paint or that sort of thing. It's in-universe stuff is where my talents in Avatar knowledge lie. Next topic is, people asked me to talk about Korrasami specifically, and then I think they roughly mentioned Makora as well. So yeah, this will be the final topic for this video, and I suppose, I've given my thoughts on Korrasami a lot in previous videos, like my reviews, written video, podcast for the finale. I've talked about it a little bit as other Korrasami related stuff has come out, the announcement of the Korra comics and stuff like that. But to kind of briefly sum it up, I don't really have any problem with Korrasami being a thing, in the sense of Korra and Asami coming together as a couple at the end. I don't have an issue with that happening, full stop. My issue comes in that I don't think it is a particularly strongly developed relationship in terms of where it came about. I would definitely agree with a lot of people who said it kind of did come a little bit out of nowhere. There were little bits of setup. I definitely would say there are small bits of setup, but for me, not enough to justify the very last scene of Korra, full stop, animated, being the start of their relationship. I don't think they should have given such a kind of underdeveloped scene the final scene of the show, because Katara and Aang coming together as a couple at the end of Avatar works because they've set that relationship up for the entire show. There are hints at this relationship in episode 1. And then all throughout the series, they touch on this relationship, these characters coming together, realizing how much they care about each other. And so it is a kind of finally, at last moment, when they do get together at the very end of the series. And it's great. This didn't have that same feel, because Korra and Asami haven't been set up for the entire series. At the absolute earliest I've seen anyone justify their relationship in any way kind of being set up is book 3, and even then I would put a large part of book 3 down to just developing them as friends. And so for me, the actual transition moments from them being friends to being in a relationship is what is very much missing for me from the show. The most obvious scene I would definitely say is the K47 reunion scene, where Asami compliments Korra about her hair and Korra blushes. I think that's the most obvious one of like an attraction between the two. But even that's relatively small, given that it's the only, I think for me, really obvious moment. There needs to be more to it than that. So that's why, for me, my thoughts on the upcoming Korra comics are more that I will base a lot of how I properly feel about Korrasami on how their relationship is done in the comics. I want the comics to not only develop Korra and Asami as a couple going forward, how they react to being in a relationship with each other, how other characters around them react to it, but I also want them to talk and kind of reflect on how they got to this point, how they came together as a couple, kind of just them discussing the key moments where they really started to see each other in a different way. That's what I need from the Korra comics, and I think Mike and Brian realized that, because these comics were announced relatively shortly after the end of the series. You know, there was a gap, definitely, but compared to like Avatar comics being announced, there wasn't that much of a gap for the Korra ones. Because I think they were aware that there were still a lot of unresolved stuff from the end of the series, and them announcing them as effectively Korrasami comics as being one of the first things they mentioned they'd cover, definitely to me highlights that they are aware that a large portion of the fandom was a bit like, huh? When Korra and Asami happened at the end. Not necessarily in a really bad way. There are people out there who are being a little bit homophobic, biphobic, whatever you want to say. But a lot of the fandom was just like, where's the setup to this? Like, where did this actually come from? Like, there were little moments touching on this, but really? You're full on going for this? Can I have an explanation here? And that's, I think, what most people feel right now. Because when the finale initially aired, everyone must remember that nearly every article, it was mainstream media, basically. Nickelodeon show does, girl-girl relationship at the end. Mike and Brian's posts confirming it as canon, that is indeed what they're going for. It was all anyone could talk about at the end of the finale. This one relationship happening eclipsed the fact that Korra was over as a show. And I think now we reflect on that and realize that, okay, yes, it was a cool moment of representation for lesbian, bisexual, whichever one you want to talk about, representation in shows, especially kids' shows. But it wasn't the most well done thing. And I think if we really want these type of relationships to be done a lot more in media, we have to be able to criticize them just as much as we do normal, like heterosexual relationships. And I think that's part of the slight issue here, is that there's a lot of people who are extremely defensive about Korrasami, when there's not really a lot to defend. Like, there's the blush scene, then there's a big gap where Korra and Asami don't really interact all that much. They have a talk here and there, line here or there, and then it's basically just the last couple of scenes in the last episode of them getting together. For the final scene of the show, the main character's key relationship at the end, you needed more than that. And I think it's a very valid criticism from a lot of people that they needed more than that, because so much of Korra, we've criticized the romances. Everyone criticized Makora at times. Everyone criticized a lot of other relationships. We have to be able to just criticize Korrasami without everyone calling everyone homophobic and stuff like that, because that's really not fair. It's not fair to people who actually have valid criticisms, and I don't think it's fair to the ship as well, because you're not letting it really... You're not, I suppose, allowing it to be a normal relationship. If you are overly defensive about Korrasami just because it is a it's kind of special girl-girl relationship. You are giving it special treatment just because that's what it is. And so that's what I really am hopeful for in the Korra comics, that they're just, the way they approach this is like, okay, it's going to be in the Korra comics, but it's not going to be the absolute focus. There's still going to be a normal plot to the Korra comics about what's going on. Other characters outside of Korra and Asami are going to have plots, but we are going to get development for their relationship. Important development that helps us better understand why this was such a big part of the finale, why this relationship happened, and how close the two actually are. Because that's, coming back to it, that is the problem. Like, I'm sure most of you guys know that I host an Avatar podcast. That's for most of Korra, it was weekly. Since the show's come to an end, it's every 2 weeks. It's the Avatar Online podcast. And we, between normal episodes of the podcast, episode reviews, and other special episodes, we've done like 200 plus episodes of that podcast, since just before the show started to present day. During episode reviews, we only ever brought up Korrasami, like, first, I suppose, properly, outside of just the fandom, you know, talking about it, and Korrasami being something that was in the fandom, in terms of actually being presented in the show, in the K407 reunion podcast, because of the blush scene. In our speculation for the finale, we roughly mentioned Korrasami, but most of us were kind of like, if there is a ship that they're going for with Korra, most of us can probably see maybe them bringing Mako and Korra back together, more so than Korra and Asami, just because the setup was like not really there for Korra and Asami. And we were aware, we've done it, doing a podcast since like 2012 on Korra. We were aware of what was going on in the fandom. We were looking out for Korrasami if it was a thing. We didn't see it until book 4. And even in book 4, there was very few scenes. And so I'm just going to end this video just by talking about some of the scenes that I think are good, I don't think are pretty much evidence. So a lot of people say book 3 is set up for their romantic relationship. And I disagree with a lot of this, purely because Mike and Brian have even said in interviews around book 3 time that one of the key parts of Korra in book 3 would be just highlighting her friendship with Asami, which was needed, because what can you say about Korra and Asami and their relationship just based on the first 2 books? They have like one notable like scene of them being close, like somewhat friends, in book 1, the car scene. And then book 2, like, I don't think there's that many memorable moments at all between Korra and Asami. A lot of the time they kind of seemed a little bit at odds with each other because of the relationship drama around Mako. And so for me, I take a lot of the early stuff in book 3 as just kind of highlighting that, look, these 2 girls don't have any issue with each other about what happened with Mako. They are actually friends. They actually have like a relationship with each other outside of just fighting over Mako. And so yes, they place Korra and Asami together for a lot of that book, but a lot of it just comes across as friends. Like, not a lot of it seems like to really hint for me towards any sort of romance type stuff for the most part. And then especially when Korra's like hurt at the end, that's the kind of point at which, like, if Korra wasn't injured, I could potentially see, you know, their relationship going somewhere else. But because Korra is then absent for 3 years, and yes, she sends one letter to Asami and not to basically anyone else, I don't think that's such a big thing that people make out. Like, in the letter that she sends back, it's just a kind of general update on how she feels. It's not this huge outpouring of feelings to Asami that really highlights something. It just highlights that there is something slightly different between Korra and Asami compared to the other 2, Mako and Bolin. And then when she comes back, yes, there's the blush scene, like, upon coming back and stuff like that. But even that moment is just kind of like, where did that come from? Like, the last time they spoke, it was like, okay, Asami is, you know, like everyone else, is like, oh, I'm sorry to see you in this condition, Korra. and then the second they meet again, it's just like blushing and stuff like that. Like, where did this really come from? Like, how did Korra just begin to see that, like, she's attracted to Asami in a different way apart from friendship? That's what was missing, and I think this is where the whole issue about Mike and Brian basically, I think, admitting that, like, it's basically their fault that it doesn't have the setup that it probably deserves, in that they've talked about how the final scene of Korra happened, in that they were thinking of Korrasami for a while, but they didn't actually do really anything in the show about it. But then when the finale came around, they really did want to do something to just show that this was the relationship they wanted at the end. And they were super surprised when Nickelodeon actually allowed them to do as much as they did do. You know, I think ultimately Mike and Brian did want them to have a kiss scene, but I think Nickelodeon did say that was a little too far. But the double handhold thing in the portal, I think, was enough to showcase that is indeed, it is a romantic thing that is happening here. And so because of that, I think Mike and Brian reflected on, like, wow, if we'd asked Nickelodeon a little bit earlier, we probably would have been allowed to do a lot more setup scenes, and we would have had the problem that we had with the fandom afterwards with regards to, you know, some criticism for this relationship. And that's for me the thing. Like, it's Mike and Brian can, like, talk all they want about, like, viewing the show, like, through a hetero lens, and that's the wrong way to do it. But, like, at the same time, that's just a bit of an excuse for, like, not actually having scenes to highlight their relationship coming together. That's why the Korra comics are happening, to develop the relationship. And that's the thing. I like Korrasami. I'm okay with that being a thing. I'm looking forward to them being a couple in the comics to see how they interact as a couple, because honestly, I don't have too much of an impression of Korra and Asami's relationship just based on the show. I think other friendships come across a little bit better than theirs, and that's just talking about, like, them as friends, not even romantically. I think, you know, Mako willing to do anything for Korra, the very kind of fun, you know, jokey relationship she has with Bolin are very strong, but then with Asami, it's just like, okay, they're two girls, okay, they're kind of close, but I don't really have too much of an impression of them. And that's why it really needs to develop. And I think one of the things I also really want with Korrasami is, don't just have Asami be Korra's girlfriend. Because obviously I think Korra is going to get more attention than Asami in the comics, just because she's the avatar and main character. But I think you have to have Asami be her own character, have her own slight plot as well outside of just their relationship. Because I think part of the weakness of the relationship is also that Asami is a relatively weak character within Korra, in that her arc in, like, the entire show is that, okay, she's an inventor, she's a pretty good fighter, but most of her main emotional plot revolves around her father in Book 1 and Book 4. Book 2 and 3, yeah, she has a little business stuff with Varric, and that kind of remains a kind of notable thing in the show. But outside of that, like, herself, outside of Book 1 and her siding against Hiroshi, Asami is, I think, one of the most, I suppose, weakly developed characters of the main cast in Korra. And so that, I think, also adds into the fact that a lot of people are kind of struggling just with regards to Korra and Asami being the main relationship at the end. It's just like, we need more on, like, almost every aspect of this relationship. And that's the thing. And I think I've been extremely fair to the ship and the scenes that showcase it in the show. It just, I think most people now have just accepted that it's the thing. A lot of people have gotten over the initial shock and what's happened, and are just like, okay, Korrasami's a thing, but it needs more. And a lot of people are super excited for the Korra comics. I am too. It's just, for me, the Korra comics are going to make up basically 90% of my opinions on Korrasami as a relationship. Because for me, the show doesn't present enough for me to really form any sort of an opinion on their relationship romantically. Because the only real inherently romantic scene we have is the very end, where they don't even talk, and it's okay, they're close just based on what's happening, but it's really just that, and then the blush scene are the only romantic things. Like, that's what I want to see more of, like what they are actually like as a couple. How do they interact romantically with each other? Which is what other ships had, like Katara and Aang, like Mako and Korra. Mako and Korra actually had some very good, like, subtle romantic development moments before they got together as a couple, because they only get together as a couple at the end of book 1, but the build to that works really well, because you know from like episodes, like they're both attracted to each other upon like first meeting. Basically, you have that scene of them kind of staring across the bay at each other, kind of in the windows. You have them talking to each other, kind of very emotionally about things. Like Korra learning about Mako's family and stuff like that. And, they kind of fall asleep next to each other, wake up. There's that awkwardness, that like tension, the romantic tension between the two, and so on. That progresses, and then you see how much Mako cares for Korra, even though he's still in the relationship with Asami. You see how much he cares. You see how much Korra cares about him and stuff like that. And ultimately, I think I'm very accepting of where they went with Mako and Korra in the end. I still would criticize a lot of how they went about doing it in book 2, but ultimately transitioning them from, I suppose, for the most part, mainly being romantically involved initially to being friends was actually well done. Realizing that perhaps they don't work well as a romantic couple. But while actually worked quite well, the reverse transition to Korrasami, I think the actual Korrasami transition from friendship to romance really wasn't there for the most part. And that's another thing to highlight, just that in general, Makora kind of covers some of these bases a lot more than Korrasami does. But in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on Korrasami, as well as the other two topics I discussed earlier on in the video. But they're just my thoughts, they're just my thoughts on the few scenes that promote Korrasami. I think I've come across a bit overly negative here, whereas I don't really feel too strongly bad about Korrasami. I just think it should have been better written. I think mistakes were made, and it'll be better as we go forward. Like the comics have improved aspects of Avatar: The Last Airbender, I think the comics will very much improve aspects of Korra. This is probably just the most obvious of them. So let me know your comments in the comment section below. Continue to recommend future discussion topics for these videos. But other than that, that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.